Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Danielle and I are thrilled to host today's webinar where we're going to arm you with all the tools you need to make your planning journey a success. Just a quick couple of comments here. So yes, this will be recorded and we'll upload it to our YouTube afterwards, and I think we'll probably share it around via an email link as well. And yes, Alison, I can see the questions being sent through. My name's Jordan. I have previously worked as a planner at a number of local authorities here in London, and I'm now at Resi as our head of planning and technical operations, where I oversee a number of our, a number of the teams you will interact with during your kind of home improvement journey. And one of those is the kind of fantastic planning function, which Danielle is a part of.
Hi, I'm Danielle. I'm a senior planner here at Resi, and I've also had quite a bit of experience working with local authorities as well as being at Resi for around 4 years now. Jordan and I are really looking forward to today's session, and our aim is to really try and simplify the planning process for you and give you a guide for like the most important things that you need to know to navigate it successfully. And between Jordan and I'm sure that we can get to the bottom of any confusion that you may have in the process.
Cool. So now you know a little bit about Danielle and I, but what about Resi more generally? Well, for homeowners across the country, we're the number one choice for extending your home. Why is that the case? You may be asking. Well, we do more projects than anyone else. And I guess as a result of that, we have that familiarity with your neighborhood and the types of projects which you can do. So, just for context, we take on around 100 new projects per month, which is about, I think, roughly 10 times more than your kind of local or standard architect. And since we started in 2017, we have done more than 9,000 projects across the UK.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. So then before we get started, I kind of wanted to take a moment to explain like why we say that we're experts in the field of planning and home improvement projects. So firstly, and something that I think is a huge plus, is Jordan, I, and the other talented planning team here at Resi have experience working for local authorities. And that means that we really understand sort of the pressures going on behind the scenes there. Um, and sort of like the key issues that they're concerned about. We know the inner workings of what's going on behind those closed council doors. And this is quite unique to a architectural practice, and most of them don't have a specialized in-house planning team. So that gives us a bit of a leg up. And additionally, Resi has more experience than any other practice in dealing with the planning system. We've submitted more than 8,000 planning applications for our projects across England, and we do it incredibly well, and we're successful around 96% of the time, which is, I think, a great statistic. And what really helps give us that greater familiarity with a large number of councils is we've submitted to more than 130 of them across the country. So we've got plenty of planning experience when it comes to getting your projects through that system. And then just a quick note before I hand back over to Jordan, if you do have any questions that you'd like to ask us, you can put those in the Q&A box and then we'll try and get through as many of them as possible at the end. If we don't get to your question and you leave your email, we can email you afterwards to answer it.
Great. Thanks, Danielle. So before we properly get started, just wanted to give a quick, overview of the topics we'll be covering in today's webinar. So firstly, and I guess this one's kind of obvious, but what is planning and why is it important? I think everyone talks about it. You've obviously heard of it, but kind of what exactly is it and why is it necessary? Um, then Danielle will take us through, permitted development. Again, I'm sure you've heard of it, but what exactly is it and how can you use it to um, for your project? Then we will look at the planning process itself. So what happens before, during, and after your application is submitted to the council. And alongside that, we'll also look at the key planning issues that pretty much every application is going to face when, or has to overcome when it's been submitted. And lastly, we'll give you some tips, kind of our top tips to help simplify your planning journey and make sure it's a success. And then we'll close with some questions. Cool. So, firstly, what is planning? I wanted to unpack what we mean by planning, as I think here at Resi, and you may well feel the same, we know that the planning process can be one of the most mystifying parts of the home improvement journey. But I think thankfully, because of the number of projects we've done at Resi, we're well versed in explaining what it is and why it's important. So I'm going to take you through that now. So what is planning? Why is it important? I guess, look, while the planning system in England can seem like a bit of a pain point, I mean, it can seem overly slow. I'm sure you've heard in the news about planning delays. The things that case officers are interested in can seem really quite trivial. The fact of the matter is, it's a hugely important system. And there's two critical things I think that really the planning process protects when it comes to home extensions. The first is that it ensures design is consistent, and the assessment process, it means that things can't or won't be built which are out of keeping, out of character, could impact the look and appearance of an area. And then secondly is it ensures that it keeps or it protects our own houses and continues to make them nice places to live. So it prevents your neighbours, for example, putting up a 4-meter high wall on your boundary, taking away your sunlight, or a terrace which takes away your privacy. So I think really it's a safeguard to ensure that I guess as painful as it is, it's a safeguard to ensure that development is not harmful when it's carried through or done. So the planning system in England operates at a national and a local level. So at the national level, we have, I guess, the national policy and guidance, which frames what councils can and I guess must put in their own local policies and guidance. And at the national level, they also set out the system for permitted development as it applies throughout the country. So permitted development, no matter where you are, should be applied in kind of the same manner because it's applied at that national level. And then at the local level, we have local policies which reflect, I guess, the more kind of important or critical issues in your local area. And those local plans and policies are developed through consultation with local residents. So you may well have seen a consultation in your area with your authority for a new local plan, for example. And I guess that local guidance and policy, it really puts the meat to the bones, I guess, so to speak, in terms of how to comply with the national policies. So, and I guess together those national and local controls are delivered through the application process to your local council. And I guess underneath that, we have the different application types. And so I guess broadly, they fall into two different categories. The first, well, for everyday homeowners, the first is permitted development, and Danielle will run through that in a bit more detail shortly. And then secondly, you have householder and full applications. And I guess that's a different, the two different avenues, I guess, you can take for your home extension. And here at Resi, about 70% of the applications we submit end up being householder applications, which means the remaining 30% are usually split between full applications. So, to be honest, that's usually if you're a flat, and permitted development. And I guess just to note there that if you are a flat, you usually don't have access to permitted development rights. So you'll usually have to submit a full application for your project. So fortunately for us, Danielle is, I guess, incredibly experienced in the area of permitted development, and she's now going to run us through what that system looks like and the kind of the key things to take away.
Thanks. I think that was a really helpful summary there. Um, so yeah, permitted development, I'm sure you've all heard of it, but what exactly is it and how does it work? Um, in a nutshell, permit development, or PD, as I'm probably going to call it, allows homeowners to improve and extend their home without needing to apply for formal permission. And permitted development, as Jordan said, is set out at the national level. So in theory, it should be applied consistently by all councils. Um, and then, whilst you don't actually need to apply for formal permission, if you do want confirmation that your project would fall under PD, you can apply for what's known as a Lawful Development Certificate, or an LDC, as Jordan mentioned earlier. Um, and then I guess there's the question, so why is permit development important and how can it help you? Well, it provides certainty to homeowners on common projects, and it can help simplify or hopefully speed up your planning journey. Additionally, one of the key benefits of an LDC application is that it doesn't involve a consultation with your neighbours, who we know can really put a spanner in the works. Um, and so here at Resi, we do consider ourselves experts when it comes to PD, and we have a 98% approval rate for LDC applications. Um, so I know you asking why not 100 if it's so simple. And it's like most things in life, PD isn't always black and white, and sometimes unforeseen issues can arise. But in the rare event that this occurs, we can help guide you through this, get you back on track, and get you in a position where you are having approval. Um, so that's covered why PD is important, but what can you do under it? And it's actually quite a bit. And some of the common projects that we do here at Resi are either ground floor, side, or rear extensions, loft conversions, and this can be hip to gable, dormers, outrigger dormers, new outbuildings, which can be a home office or a gym or just an extra little living space. Um, New projects such as boundary fences and walls, or the installation of new windows, doors, and roof lights. And some of the photos that you see here are some of the projects that we've done at Resi, which may be possible under permitted development. You can see some lofts there and some big dormers. Um, and then some of the less common projects which can be done under PD, subject to the relevant conditions being met, are you can even get a two-story rear extension under permitted development sometimes. And then also, and which is becoming more and more prevalent, you can get green technology, you can have solar panels, you can have air source heat pumps. The guidance for air source heat pumps has recently changed, which means that they can now have cooling functions as well, which is a big change that people are keen to take advantage of. So, yeah. Um, then I guess, like, what if you want to build a rear extension that is a bit larger than what you can typically get under PD? One of the options for this, without going through formal planning application, is called a larger home extension, which is quite aptly named. And you can apply for rear extensions that are either up to 8 meters in depth for a detached house, or 6 meters for all other housing types. That's semi-detached, terraces, things like that. Um, and whilst this scheme does fall under the same umbrella legislation as PD, the applications for these larger extensions require what is known as prior approval from your council. To put this simply, it means that the council will send letters to your adjoining neighbours informing them of the proposed extension. And then, if any of your neighbours object to the scheme, the council unfortunately has the power to refuse your application if they think that it could negatively impact your neighbour. So it's the one outlier really that your neighbours do get notified on. So then, moving on to sort of what you should keep in mind when you're thinking about using PD for your project. Um, One, and what I consider to be one of the most important things is, do you actually have your permitted development rights? Not everybody has them. They could have been removed. As Jordan previously noted, flats don't benefit from PD rights. However, it's also common for these to have been removed from new build properties or properties in conservation areas. If your PD rights have been removed, don't worry about it. It's not the end of the world. You just need to apply for either a householder or a full application. Secondly is if your property has been previously extended. If so, this can make permitted development more difficult, but again, not to worry. It gets more difficult because the combination of PD elements may take that extension out of the PD regulations. So it's really important to be aware of what is existing and what is original on the property. The third, and I cannot stress this enough, as we've sort of pointed out a couple of times already, is please discuss with your neighbours, especially if you're doing a large home extension. As noted, if your neighbours object to the scheme, the council are likely to refuse it. So, get them on your good side, figure out whether they're going to object in advance, have that conversation. If the first time they're hearing about it is from the council and that's the first place that they're going to go with their grievances, if you can hash that out beforehand, you may be able to avoid that objection formally going in on your application. And then lastly is if you have a unique housing type, given the variation of design of individual houses, extensions to unusual property types can not usually be done under PD. As with the above examples, this isn't an issue. You can apply for a householder. I think with PD, what's really important is don't try and fit a square shaped block into a circle hole. If it's not going to work for you, it's not going to work. You'd get refused on a technical reason, and it's just flat out. If householder is better for you, go down that route, I think. But hopefully that was a useful summary of permitted development and how you can use it to simplify your planning journey. But I'm going to hand you back over to Jordan now, who's going to deep dive into what actually happens once you're in that planning process.
That's great. Thanks, Danielle. So I guess, yeah, now we've run through the application types that are available to you and your project, and Danielle's provided that really useful summary of permitted development and how you can take advantage of PD rights. We're going to look at what actually happens in and around that time when you enter the formal planning process. So I guess first off, I'm going to talk you through what happens just before you start that planning journey. So I guess we'll call this the preparation stage. And I think at this stage of the process, it's all about understanding what you've got to work with. So what precedent is there on your street? What is achievable within your local council's design guidelines and local policy? And I guess also, like Danielle just touched on, do you have those permitted development rights available to you, and can you take advantage of those for your project? So here at Resi, your designer and your planning consultant, they will take on the bulk of this work, and they'll help you to understand the key issues and risks about your project so you can make an informed decision about kind of what sort of proposal you want to take forward. And this may also include something called pre-application advice, which is, I guess, a step you can take before submitting an application to the local council, which gives you a bit more certainty about your proposal before you submit that formal application and any changes you might need to make. So once you've weighed up the options and the risks involved, your designer and your planning consultant will then prepare a range of technical documents to support your application, including your architectural plans, obviously very important. And then they'll take the plunge and submit your application to the council, which is where their part of the process begins. And so I guess the first step when an application lands on the council's desk is called validation. And I guess this is the step where the council is going to check over everything which has been submitted to make sure they have everything they need to understand what your project entails, and also to check it against their policy and guidance at that early stage. I guess in our experience, this can be a bit of a tricky stage sometimes. Often councils at the moment will look to make applications invalid. So it is really important that all of the documents required and information required is submitted up front to ensure your application isn't delayed. And then once your application has passed this hurdle, hopefully, there's no bumps along the way, a planning officer will be assigned to your application. And then at this stage, I guess it depends on your application type, like Danielle touched on. If you are permitted development, you may not need to have consultation, but if you submit a householder or a full application, then this is the time, kind of right at the start of the application process, where your neighbours will be consulted and given a chance to comment on the application. Again, why it's very important to speak to them beforehand is what you don't want is the first kind of they hear about it is from the council, because that's obviously going to potentially cause some issues. And then once that kind of consultation stage is complete, your planning officer will then undertake their assessment about whether what you've proposed ticks the boxes, I guess, both at the national level, but also the local policies that we've explored beforehand. And during this time, and depending on how ambitious your project is, the case officer or planning officer may reach out for requesting minor changes or clarification about what has been submitted. And so while all this is going on, if you have a planning agent like Danielle or I or the other consultants here at Resi, they will be managing those communications with your case officer and proactively reaching out and helping things along towards hopefully a positive outcome and heading off any potential issues. And also engaging, I think, early with the case officer to show a willingness to work with them is a really critical part of the process. And I guess here at Resi, we're able to kind of turn things around quickly if necessary to really give your application and your project the best chance of a positive outcome. And so in terms of, I guess, timeframes, I think it's a question a lot of you will have is how long does it take for an application to be decided? So, I mean, most applications, councils will have a target of 8 weeks to determine the application. I would take it, I would give yourself probably 12 weeks, to be honest, given some of the delays that are being experienced. We push for decisions as soon as possible, but obviously it's in the kind of authority, the council's power to issue the decision. So we can help them along, but there may be delays on their end to get that decision across the line. But it's usually not more than 12 weeks. And for the most part, it's within that kind of 8-week time frame. And then hopefully, and in Resi's case, in the vast majority of instances, your case officer will come to a positive conclusion, and they'll send through your formal decision notice approving planning permission. And then once you've got that approval in hand, you can really kind of relax and take it easy, to be honest, because that is one of the most frustrating parts of the home improvement process out of the way. And I think the reason it's so frustrating is, the unpredictability and the lack of control on timings. So once you do get that approval, it's a real kind of sigh of relief, I think. And once you have that decision in hand, the good news is you have 3 years to begin work. So there isn't a rush to resolve things and get started straight away. And I guess it gives you the flexibility to pursue the project at your own pace. So I think also important to note here that if you have submitted a householder or a full application, so not the PD application, which we touched on beforehand, there could be conditions attached to your decision. and sometimes they might require further information to be submitted. It's unusual, but it's just something to keep in mind and to check when the council does issue your decision. So yeah, that's roughly it. That's how the application process should unfold. Cool.
Thank you. So we now understand what you'll be going through when you're in the planning process, but then what are some of those key issues that we look for when we are planning our submission? Um, Before you go in through your householder or your full applications, what are some of those issues that the council will be considering? So there's two key issues which are always considered by the case officer during the application. The first one of these is design, and the second of these is impact on your neighbours, and I'll go into both of those shortly. But there are also some other key issues that could influence the outcome of your application, and it's important to understand these early on in your planning journey. It's really, really essential to understand and identify if there are any constraints which apply to your property. And these are additional restrictions that are designated um, to your house or your area, and this can include things like a conservation area or a flood risk zone. So these additional constraints can likely be some key issues in the assessment of your actual application. So the issue of design encompasses a number of different factors relating to the project or extension. And this can include how visible it is, its size, and in particular, whether it would dominate the host building, and whether the aesthetic, which includes materials, would be sympathetic to the host. So where design is of particular importance is if you are extending to the side or the front, basically anywhere where it would be visible from the street and would have an impact on the street scene. So even something as small as a porch could be classified as out of character for an area. So, that's where they kind of put a magnifying glass over design. Heritage as well is of particular importance. If your property is listed or in a conservation area, design is really, really essential to get right on these. There's a real need for your project to respect that heritage asset that is in place. Councils have dedicated conservation teams who will assess the impact of your proposal from a heritage perspective. So whilst even the case officer will be looking at it, there's another level of sort of specialised assessment that gets put on those types of applications. But a quick fact that I'd quite like to interject with is that at least every local authority has at least one conservation area listed in their borough, and there's around 10,000 in total of them across the country. If you're unsure whether your property is listed or within a conservation area, it can be quite difficult to navigate the council's websites and understand if that applies to you. So you can book in for one of our. So moving on to the issue of neighbouring impacts, again, neighbours coming up again, they really, really can influence your application. I think it's really important to understand what could negatively impact your neighbour and what we look for when we're trying to understand what that is. In our experience, the key impacts a case officer will look for is would the size and the position of the extension result in a loss of light to your neighbours? Would it overshadow their windows, their gardens? There's a big thing about habitable rooms, what that is, whether they're going to be negatively impacted. Another would be, would the size of your extension appear overbearing to your neighbours? In particular, if it's you want to go a bit larger with your project, just think, is your neighbour going to look out of their back kitchen window and see a really tall 6 metre deep wall right next to them where usually they would have had an open view across the gardens? That is going to negatively impact them ultimately. So, we have to be respectful of that. And then, is there going to be any new windows or sight lines that would allow you to overlook your neighbours and lead to a loss of privacy? This can be first floor side windows, roof terraces, things like that. There is ways to mitigate these, but ultimately we don't want to be staring directly into our neighbours' properties, and they don't want you looking at them. Um, so I think it's important to note here, because I mentioned previously that if a neighbour objects to your larger home extension, that is likely to be refused. That's not always like necessarily the case for a householder. The case officer will still assess the application and make their professional assessment on it. They just have to acknowledge that your neighbour has made um, a comment on your application. Um, but if your neighbour does object on amenity grounds, then the planning officer will look at that in a little bit more detail. And then, in our experience, neighbouring impacts are the most likely to result in the application being refused or needing amendments, but it doesn't automatically rule your application out of approval. If it is acceptable, it will still be considered acceptable regardless of your neighbour lodging a complaint. So again, speak to your neighbours first. Can you talk it out? Can you hash it out? Do you want to potentially make amendments before even submitting? All of these things can just mean it runs a bit more smoothly. So then, going on to that technical and other, it's a bit of a catch-all, but like these could really influence your application. Um, this isn't all of them, but it's a summary of some of the most frequent ones we encounter. Flood risk is really important. Again, essential to identify early on in the process. Is your area prone to flooding? What zone is it in? There's different flood risk zones which require different levels of information to be submitted. The secondly is impact on trees. Are any of your trees protected? If you're in a conservation area, it's very likely that your mature tree is going to be protected. In this case, you might need an arboricultural report. You might need to put up safety measures whilst you're building. If you're planning on removing a tree, you might be required to plant a new one in its place. So a tree survey may be required by the council if you're planning on doing any work that would impact them. The thirdly is the effect on wildlife and nature conservation. The most common of these is bats, particularly in rural areas. If your property is in what the council considers to be a suitable bat roosting area, then they will require a preliminary roost assessment. This has to be completed most of the time on submission of the application. So again, important to identify early on, get that in along with the submission. The council can turn away your application if that isn't provided from the start. And then another important one to understand, which is a bit different from the others, is greenbelt. There can be restrictions on how much you can actually extend your property by if you're in a greenbelt. Can be quite difficult to understand because each council has their own regulations for this. It could be percentage, it could be square meter, and they're all different. So honing in on whether that applies to you and what your specific rules are is again really important. So yeah, like I said, it's sort of a summary of our most common issues, but it's not exhaustive by any means. Dark sky areas can impact how many roof lights you can have. So each council is completely different with what they'll allow. I think something to note is that if any of these issues or constraints do lie over your property or you are facing any of them, we do actually also have a Connect team in-house which helps put you in touch with an arboriculturalist or an ecologist, people who can do these specialist surveys for you. Although we're great at planning, we're not very good at bat reports ourselves. We can't come to your house, but we know people who can, and that can help you do that. But yeah, back over to you, Jordan.
That's great. Thanks, Danielle. I think it was a really useful kind of summary of the kind of the key issues that most planning applications faced. So I guess now we've set out all of the problems. I think it's time to give you a headline tips when it comes to really simplifying your planning journey and kind of maximizing your chance for success. So I guess the first one is to use a planning consultant or a planning agent when you do submit. Obviously, we would say this, but it genuinely does make a huge difference to the outcome of your application. And while it shouldn't be the case, the planning system is incredibly confusing and it can be frustrating unless you are experienced with the nuts and bolts of it. So, using people like Danielle, myself and the other consultants here at Resi who have this previous experience working for local authorities, I think it helps to take some of the stress out of that process. I'm not going to say it's going to be stress free, but hopefully we can make it as stress free as possible, and we can deal with any unexpected bumps and keep on top of case officers and get all the admin done to kind of keep the application on track. So yeah, having a consultant I think really is worthwhile to get that positive outcome in hand as quickly as possible. The second, and I think this is a really important one, and maybe something that isn't always considered at the start of a journey, is to be realistic. And I think this is what this really means is to listen to the advice about what can and can't be done. I think as planners, we're not here to take the fun out of being creative and coming up with a chic new addition to your home. But what we're here to do is to ensure that we allow that creativity to lead to something that your builder can actually kind of crack on and build rather than something which just never makes it off your architect's drawings. So I think understanding that planning advice early and then making an informed decision based on the issues and the risks that relate to your property is really critical to maximize your chance at success. And I think also the speed at which you get there, if that is important to you. The third thing, I guess the third tip is to understand your priorities. Again, really important to ensure that these are in place, I think, early on in your project journey. So if your priority is speed and budget, for example, um, you're going to want to fully minimize the risks of your project. And that might mean being either conservative or utilizing your PD rights. Whereas if your priority is absolutely maximizing the kind of the space created, that might mean being kind of really creative with your design. Or, well, I guess, yeah, if it could mean being really creative with your design. And also, if you aren't as concerned about budget and time, then you can be that bit more brave, I think, and ambitious with your application, um, if that speed isn't as important to you as well. So I think as part of your priorities, it's also really important to understand what your bottom lines are so that when you enter that planning process, you already know what compromises you might or are willing to make to get your application across the line. Are you willing to change the pitch of your roof or the materials of your extension? I think just going into it knowing what you are and aren't willing to compromise on is a really useful kind of tip going into that planning process. And lastly, we've said it numerous times already, but I mean our top tip honestly is to speak to your neighbours as early as possible in the process. Particularly, I think if you are going through that larger home extension scheme, which Danielle run us through, because if they do object in that instance, like there's a very high chance your application could be refused. If they don't comment, then then that can't happen basically. So really critical there. I think getting your neighbour on side early can not only make the planning process easier by avoiding objections and the various delays that they can bring, but also engaging with them early. Make sure that any kind of technical issues like party wall agreements that you will encounter kind of later on in your project journey are kind of made much smoother. So I guess, yeah, those were our top tips. And I guess hopefully that was a kind of a useful overview of the planning process and how to ensure that your planning journey is a success. So we have about 20 minutes remaining now. So thank you everyone who has posted a question so far. We're going to try and get through as many of these as possible. And just if you haven't submitted your question yet, you still have a chance to do this before the end of the webinar. And if we don't get to your question, we'll be responding to all of those via email or message after the webinar has finished. So I guess the first question here, Danielle, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Chris Appleyard asked, how do I go about starting the planning process? Um, it can obviously be daunting. Obviously, understand what you want to do, why you want to extend, where you want to extend. And then I think getting in touch with an architect to help you through that and a consultant is the most important first step. You can't submit for planning without detailed drawings. These have to be scalable. Like I said, there's lots of other things that you have to understand before going through planning. Are there any constraints on your property? Do you need any other further reports? So we usually take all that burden away from you. So get in touch with a consultant, get in touch with an architect, get some advice if what you want to do is feasible, and then start that design journey, start coming up with some drawings, and then find out everything that you need to submit them.
Great, thank you, Danielle. So next question here is, I guess, regarding heritage. So do you have heritage consultants on board, and have you done grade listed properties too? I guess answering the first part of the question, I guess through the Connect service, which Danielle touched on previously, we have heritage consultants that we work with on, I guess, those very kind of sensitive heritage projects. And this includes listed buildings. So we've done we've submitted a number of applications for listed buildings, extensions. I think also important to note here that if your building is listed, anything which is internal is going to require listed building consent. So yeah, we certainly have experience in that, and we can work with heritage consultants for those particularly tricky kind of listed properties. So yes, is I guess the answer.
Yeah, so we've got a question here about neighbours. If you do not get on with your neighbour, but your extension makes no impact on their property, would an objection by them veto any plan? I covered that, but yeah, just to reiterate, an objection on a household or a full isn't an automatic no. Like you said, if it makes no impact on their property, then they don't have that overwhelming sway. The case officer will still assess and still approve the application if they deem it to be acceptable.
Great. So next question here. So I guess application at the early stage, does this need plans for both planning and building regulations, or can these be done separately? And also a question in terms of, I guess, quoting based off the building regulations drawings. I guess here at Resi, look, in terms of how the speed at which you kind of want to work at, we kind of work with you. We find it useful to, I guess it depends on kind of how ambitious your project is. If it's a fairly kind of low risk or not overly ambitious project, we find it useful to do building regulations drawings at the same time as planning, to be honest, because planning otherwise can be a bit of a dead time in your project journey. So I think it's useful to kind of look forward when you're in that planning kind of process or planning stage and look at things like building regulations. So I guess they can be done separately, but we often advise that they are done at the same time. And I guess kind of from that also means that we're able to get to things like tenders and quotes from contractors and builders quicker, but as a result. So I guess the answer is it's we can proceed at whatever pace you are looking to do your project, but we often advise doing planning and building regulations at the same time, just to get you on site as quickly as possible.
So we've got a question here about typical time frame from submission to decision. Jordan touched on this. Statutory is 8 weeks. We like to give about 12. But we actually have a tech system in place where we input the date that an application is made valid and then the date that we receive that decision. So we have live updates for each authority with the average time scale for that specific one. So we're able to give you a more realistic timeline on your authority, whether there's delays at the moment, and how long you'll typically wait for use specifically, which I think can be really helpful.
That's great. Thanks, Danielle. Uh, so next question here is, I guess, about the application process with the case officer. So, if Resi is managing the relationship with the case officer, I guess will we share everything with you and confer with you before taking any action? E.g., if the case officer gets in touch with requests to clarify or tweak a design, would we respond immediately or check with you first? We would always check with you first. We're not going to make any kind of decision about your project without speaking with you. So we'll absolutely always be having that conversation with you before making changes. Um, I guess important to note, sometimes there can be, we try to avoid these situations. Sometimes case officers can be quite pushy and kind of request that changes are made in a really kind of quick time period. Where that does happen, we try and kind of agree to a brief extension of time just to allow for that discussion with kind of with the relevant client to ensure that any change which is made is done in a manner which is acceptable to them and still kind of results in a project um, which kind of is usable or functional for you at the end.
We've got a question here that says, can a householder planning permission be transferred to the buyer of the property? The answer to that is yes. Um, whilst your name would be on the application, the permission belongs to the property, not the owner of it. So if you sell your house and the permission is still valid, which you've got 3 years to commence building from the date of decision. If you sell your house within that time, the new owner of the property can commence with those works within that time scale.
Great. So we've got a question here about habitable rooms, which we, I guess, touched on in the neighbouring impact part of the session. So you mentioned habitable rooms as a big thing. Can you please explain what these are and what impact this has on planning? So I guess a habitable room is any room which is kind of used as kind of a living space, I guess is the easiest way to define it. So the most common rooms which are defined as habitable are usually bedrooms and living spaces or living rooms. And the reason why these are important is because when the case officer is assessing your application, they're going to pay more attention to those particular rooms and how they're impacted by your proposal, compared to, say, a bathroom which has an obscured window, or a kitchen which isn't a space which is kind of lived in, so to speak. So there's always going to be a greater focus from a council on habitable rooms and the impact of your proposal on them. And that's something we always try to take account of when we are designing a project is what do those neighboring kind of windows serve? And we have various, I guess, tests which we can run to determine the impact that that'll have on those windows to kind of give your project the best chance of success.
Yeah. We've got one here that was, I was told that hip to gable loft conversions that are bigger than permitted development are unlikely to be approved in planning. Is this your view too? Um, Sort of, yes. With loft works, specifically hip to gable, they really do change the view and the character of the property, especially if you're in a semi-detached or a terrace where roofs mirror each other. But the roof is such an important part of the house that gives it character, that really does give it a profile within the street. So too much hip to gable on that is typically resisted by councils. We do see in a lot of design guides from councils that hip to gables aren't allowed. So doing those under permitted development is the most common way to get those approved. They can be quite difficult to achieve under a householder if it's bigger than the volume allowance that you've got under PD.
So next question here, I guess, is regarding the process around changes once an application has been submitted. So I guess per your point about making what I'm going to do practical, I'm concerned that changes to plans will become expensive. Is there a council fee each time you make a change? I guess this does depend on your council. For the most part, historically, there hasn't been a charge, and councils have been willing to accept changes under live applications. I will say there's been a bit of a shift in the last kind of 12 months or so, and we are finding that more councils are charging for things like amendments. I still think they are in the minority, but I'm not going to say that there isn't going to be a fee from your council to submit an amendment. Um, I guess it's always eh, once I guess it's part of that conversation that we'll have once the if that request does come in from the case officer, we can look at what that change is that's been requested, whether it'll have an impact on your kind of project and its functionality, and then we can kind of review that with you. And sometimes we can push back against the council's request if we think it's unreasonable or if there are grounds to. So yeah, I guess maybe I can't give an exact answer on that. It'll depend on the council that you're in. Again, we have a good relationship with a lot of councils, and so um, we can have that discussion with the case officer and hopefully kind of arrive at a reasonable point to ensure your project is still kind of practical and functional for you.
Just to quickly touch on that as well, if the changes that you want to make are after your planning permission has been approved, the level of change would denote whether you have to go back to the council or not. And then if you do, there's layers of applications that you can do, starting at a non-material amendment for minor changes, which is around £43. So they can be small fees if you do have to go back to the council. Um, Yeah. So we've got one here that said, would adding a second story always need full planning permission if needing to raise the roof height, or would any of those other schemes apply? So I'm going to assume this is adding a second story onto a bungalow and raising the height of that roof. There is a route through permitted development called Class AA. We find it to be incredibly restrictive though, and actually ends up being no different than just submitting a householder. There's actually further restrictions than submitting a householder. Has to be built within a certain threshold of years. It can't be within a certain proximity to an airport, things like that. And one of the conditions on there is actually that the case officer is allowed to assess whether it's acceptable within that street scene, which is what they would do under a householder anyway. So um, We think that it is actually ends up being easier to go the full planning permission route rather than permitted development because they're just as difficult. So yeah, and then you've usually got a few more things that you can actually play around with under a householder. For example, materials under permitted development, your materials have to match what is existing. So those further restrictions means that you're more restricted.
Um, got time for a couple more here. So, question from Hannah: is there a difference in cost of submission to a council between permitted development and full planning? The answer is yes. So the permitted development application, which is an application for a lawful certificate, is usually half the cost of a householder or full application. There are some I guess, nuances to that. And we can, I guess, kind of clarify what the application fees would be once we kind of have finalised the project.
So got one here that says, how large can you build an outbuilding through PD? There's restrictions on height and proximity to boundary. There's also a restriction that says that you can't go over 50% of the original garden space. However, the actual square footage of your outbuilding, there's not a restriction on. They don't give an exact figure, but what they do say is that the building has to be sort of relevant to the size of your house and what's the word I'm looking for?
Um, we'll come back to it.
We'll
Yeah.
come back. But essentially, it has to be sort of like relevant to the size of your house. So if you're planning on installing an outbuilding in your back garden that is about half the size of your house um, area at that moment in time or larger, then the council may deem it to not be sort of relevant or subservient, and therefore it can't be permitted development. There's concerns about it not being used for residential purposes, so they may not accept an outbuilding under PD if the floor area is too large in relation to the main property.
Maybe one more there from
hmm
Johnny.
Yeah, so are negative pre-app responses open to further consultation, exploration, or is it just a case of submitting full planning? That depends on your council. A pre-app uh, is a route that is set up per council. It's not a government or national process like the actual planning application itself. So they create their own service of a pre-app. So they can do their own restrictions, their own fees, timelines, things like that. Some councils, if you get a nice enough case officer, they'll let you ask follow-up questions. Some have an actual follow-up service, which can be a little bit cheaper than the original. Some you can just do another pre-app. There's sort of no restriction on how many pre-apps you can submit and how many planning applications you can submit. It just kind of depends on what you can get away with that case officer.
That's great. Thanks, Danielle. So I guess, yeah, thank you everyone for your questions. It's 1 o'clock now, so that's kind of all the time we have for today. I guess on behalf of both Danielle and I, thank you very much for joining. I hope the session has been useful and has shed some light on how to simplify your planning journey and how to make it a success. If we didn't get round to answering your question today, we will be responding afterwards. And I guess if you have any other planning related questions, what we'll be doing is sharing a link after this webinar, which will allow you to book in an advice call direct with Danielle, myself, or another one of our planning consultants, so we can run you through any planning questions that you do have. So I guess, yeah, look, enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to hopefully speaking with you soon.